Hello, hello, hello. Okay, so welcome to the Malika Rights channel. We're here again to discuss the Rings of Power. So I've just finished watching episode 6 and episode 7. Episode 6 was sort of recommended to me as supposedly a really good episode. Um, kind of have I agree, but at the same time I have differing opinions to um to that particular comment about episode 6. So I'm just going to make a few brief points and then from there I will just sort of be going back and forth and answering questions. So my first point about episode 6 in particular is that it had some really good elements. For example, the character of Ada, which is the sort of father of the orc, so that's what they've set him up to be. He's a good character, I believe. I think that his characterization is perhaps one of the best in the series. In comparison to everyone else, he seems like the most fleshed out character. And I really enjoyed watching him every single time that he was on screen. Whereas for everyone else, I was sort of in two minds about them, and I didn't necessarily enjoy their stage presence as much as I enjoyed his. So there's definitely something to be said about the skill level of the writers. It's not that they're completely terrible because certain characters show potential, but overall, I just think that the writing of the show has been terrible. It hasn't been great, and I think that's a real shame because from what I've sort of gathered from the fans, there isn't any real enthusiasm for this show. There are some good elements. I personally think that the music in episode 6 was a bit better because there were times where the music was playing in the background and it wasn't too overpowering, which had been the case in previous episodes. So there were definitely some things that I think went a little bit better. Perhaps they're just learning with time. But the unfortunate thing with the series is that you kind of have to hook people in almost immediately. I also started watching The House of Dragon just to make a quick comparison between how I was so quickly pulled in with The House of Dragon in comparison to The Rings of Power, where I was bored in the first episode and it wasn't really much to pull me in, but almost immediately with The House of Dragon, we were pulled into this world. And that prologue is so strong in comparison to Galadriel's prologue in The Rings of Power. So there's definitely an issue with the writing. And when you compare these two kind of works together, it's easier to see the issues with the Rings of Power, and it's easier to see that the writing is the issue with the Rings of Power. So that would be my first point, that there were good things. For example, the music in the background from episode 6 was better. Ada definitely was the standout character from um, from episode 6. So definitely there were things that were okay with the series or that particular episode. However, Galadriel, I think my second point really is about Galadriel, and I think that she is a character that I've sort of come to terms with. I think a lot of the hatred towards Galadriel is that we are still having this sort of perception of her and how she should be, and then there is how she's being written. So in the last live stream, I said that if you're still watching this series as a Lord of the Rings series, you're going to be greatly disappointed. But if you can detach yourself and just watch it as a random fantasy series with things that are sort of familiar, as a sort of fan fiction, an expensive fan fiction, then there are going to be things that you enjoy. I personally think that Galadriel is being deliberately written as the morally grey character. Now, when you look at Galadriel as she's supposed to be in the books, this is not how she's supposed to be written. And so when you keep doing this comparison, you'll never go, or everything she does everything she does, everything she does is going to be extremely jarring. So I think so Aragma Verilian says expensive and quite boring fan fiction. Unfortunately, that seems to be the case. Hi Aragma, it's lovely to see you or to read your comment. But like I was saying about Galadriel, I personally think that the way she's being written is to set her up as a morally grey character. And that has nothing to do with her portrayal in the book. She's definitely an original character with a familiar name. That's what they've done with her. And I think that I've come to the point where I can accept that. And I'm not expecting to view this character as the Galadriel that I'm familiar with. The only thing I would say with my particular approach is that sometimes they try to make her this virtuous character and it doesn't really work. She'll say things that are completely hypocritical. Well, she talks to Theo about pride, even though that's in episode 7, but she talks to Theo about pride. And I thought to myself, of all the people to talk about pride, madam, you have no place. So, things like that, where they'll try and make her into this sort of virtuous character, but she's done nothing to earn that. And I think that's the problem overall with the Rings of Power is that the writers are doing a lot of things that they haven't earned. So they will create certain plot points and they haven't earned the right for those plot points to actually to have the sort of payoff that they want them to have. So they're doing a lot of things where they introduce new ideas and they expect the audience to react positively, but they haven't earned the right for the audience to have any sort of emotional connection to these characters. In There's a particular scene where Bronwyn, the human woman that's in love with the dark-skinned elf Arondir, they try and act like she's about to die, but we don't really we there's no stakes in in this series, and so we know that there are certain characters that just won't die. And so trying to build the tension with their deaths doesn't really make sense because we know they're not going to die, and there's no sense of actual we don't care what happens to them because we know at the end of the day they're going to be all right. And that moment of tension doesn't really last any more than 30 seconds. And it's immediately sort of cut short because we know there's no fooling the audience at this point that Bronwyn would not have died. So I'm just going to go to Aragma's comment. They could have done so much more, even with their made up characters. So much missed opportunities here. By the way, people are calling the not hobbits hypocrite. They're calling them Hippocrates. Well, it's that's a very interesting name to give the Harfords. So far, I haven't been too mad about the addition of the Harfords, but episode 7 made me a little bit worried about what they want to do with these characters because rather than them staying in the background, they're giving them much more of an active role. They had a direct confrontation in the 7th episode with villainous figures. We don't know who these 3 women are going around supposedly hunting down the man who fell from the sky in a meteor. We don't know who they are, but because they're sort of villainous characters, the fact that there was a direct confrontation between the Harfoots and these villainous characters means that some evil presence in Middle Earth is aware of the existence of hobbit like creatures, which obviously goes against what was set up in the Peter Jackson movies, where the hobbits and their ancestors were really not known to anybody in Middle Earth. And so that's what makes them such unlikely heroes in the trilogy. So to have them have this sort of showdown or reveal themselves to these villainous characters, it makes it even more unlikely that Sauron later on would not have ever heard of hobbits. And so that's a very difficult thing to navigate, and I it makes me worry that they will not have any sort of continuity with the trilogy or with Tolkien's works in general. They've changed quite a lot of things, which happens with my third point. Um, because I'm pretty sure everyone knows by now about the massive eruption. I mean, Galadriel covered in ash was part of the trailer, so it's not really a spoiler, even though this live stream will obviously contain spoilers. But um, the fact that there was a massive eruption and we see massive loss of life, and Galadriel is hit head on with this ash and somehow survives. We can talk about the fact that there is fantasy logic and that plot armor obviously exists. However, the sheer amount of ash that Galadriel was hit with, we know that elves can die. We've seen elves die, and we've seen them perish. It's not something that the series pretends can't happen. But Galadriel seems to have some kind of super armor, because when I watched that scene, I thought to myself, she's in a metal suit of armor. I I don't know if you've ever touched anything metal while it's remotely hot, but she had to be sort of burnt alive, even just with the heat hitting her metal suit of armor. She would have to face a lot more trauma than what we see. And I would understand if we didn't see Galadriel suffer and no one else around her was affected by by the blast of the volcano. But Queen Muriel loses her sight. We see several bodies that died just from the blast. Um, we also see people on fire. The environment has been completely consumed with flames. Isildur, we know he's not dead, but the showrunners act like Isildur perished in a burning house. So we know that there's been casualties. We know that the blast had an effect. However, for Galadriel to come out completely unscathed, not even with burn marks, considering that every other character has burn marks, it seems very unnatural, especially with what it goes against the internal logic of the series itself. So Aragma says Guy Ladriel is max level and has had too much hit points. A mere volcanic eruption is nothing to her. Moreover, she has a tempest in her famous line that there is a tempest in her that cannot be quelled by anyone. Um, and I'm pretty sure that Galadriel has suffered a lot, and definitely I'm sympathetic to the revelation that she lost both her husband and brother. However, Galadriel is not a likable character, and that brings me back to my second point, which is I don't think the showrunners are setting her up to be a likable character. I've heard a lot of people say that she's unlikable and that they detest her, and that she isn't the Galadriel they know, and I think that's the point. I don't think the showrunners are trying to give us a recognizable Galadriel. So to try and keep comparing her to what she should have been, I think it's better to just pay attention to what she actually is, and that is a morally grey character who they're setting up, I hope, to have a radical redemption arc. And this is further supported by the fact that Celeborn, Galadriel's husband, is not actually confirmed to be dead. He just disappeared and she assumes that he's dead. But there's been no actual confirmation that Celeborn is dead. What I think is going to happen is that Celeborn is going to come back. We're going to have some explanation of what he's been doing this entire time. And his presence is going to soften Galadriel. And because all the other characters around Galadriel know that she's too much, even the characters that were supposed to see it as heroic, they've talked about the fact that she could fan the flames that she's trying to put out. They tried to send her away because she could potentially be more trouble than she's worth. Other characters who are supposed to be heroic figures call her out on her behavior. Villains even say that she's more villainous than them. Other has a particular line where he says that her search for Morgoth's successor should have ended in the mirror. The showrunners aren't completely blind. They know that Galadriel's not a likable character, and I think that's the point. But I've seen a lot of people continue to act like the writers aren't aware of this when everything is pointing to the fact that they're trying to shape Galadriel out to be this unlikable character who is probably going to go through a radical shift. Because it would be one thing if everyone was affirming her decisions, but most people aren't. Most people don't like her decisions. And let's not ignore the fact that in order for Numenor to come to Middle Earth, yes, Galadriel was the one brought forth the idea, but it relied on Halbrand actually being on board for the idea to go through, because no one here really trusts Galadriel. No one likes her. And this is something that the showrunners are very aware of. Um, they try to give her some good qualities in order for us to kind of know that she's not completely evil, but overall she's not someone to root for. And I think that's what they're going for. They wouldn't be pushing this hard and making her say things like, I'll kill all, she says to Other, I'll kill all your offspring and I'll leave you alive so that you can see, you can be the last, and I can whisper in your piped ear that your wretched line ends with you. That's a very stereotypical villain speech. So, and I think they even lifted that from somewhere, because I'm pretty sure I've heard that before from somewhere. It felt so familiar. It felt like the stereotypical villain speech, um, and very kind of anti-hero, mad king reminiscent sort of speech. So I don't think the showrunners are blind to the fact that Galadriel is unlikable. I think that's the point. And if we can just accept that and move forward with it, I think there'll be less friction with her characterization arc. And I think what they're going for is a radical shift brought about by her sort of being softened by the return of her husband eventually, and also by her interactions with different characters. So Aragma has commented, they are reshooting parts of season 2 now. I have no idea how the showrunners are going to dig themselves out of this pit. I have been paying attention to some of the reviews, to the ones who love this show, and the ones who hate it, and the ones who couldn't care less. So I don't believe that this show will make the money back in the way that they expect it to, just because they've deviated so much and there's so many problems with the writers. Unless they change the writers and drastically change the storyline to fit something more familiar to Tolkien, I don't think they can succeed in gaining all that money that they've spent back. Um, and I think that the reshoots are in some ways a response to the to the way that the show has developed. I don't think that negative reviews matter as much as apathetic reviews. So negative reviews can easily be dismissed as racism, as homophobia, even though we haven't seen like a homosexual relationship in this series so far, but it can be dismissed under any one of these categories, like, oh, the fans are racist, they're sexist, or there's some ist. But um apathetic reviews or people not even watching the show is more of a driving force for these creators than any negative review will ever be. People clocking out of the show and not watching it, especially with big competitors like House of Dragon and other shows that are drawing people's attention, like the Jeffrey Dahmer series, they are competing against other shows that are out at the moment, and they're competing for people's attention. As far as I know, both series, House of Dragon and Rings of Power, are kind of in step with each other. They have a similar amount of episodes out. So I personally think that the competition and the lack of response from people is what is probably provoking the reshoots, rather than people saying, "Oh, I hate it," because they anticipated that, and that's why they went so hard in the marketing for diversity, because it gave them a way to say, "Well, everyone who doesn't like this is a racist." But to people who aren't even commenting and are just not bothered with the show and checking out, you can't really say anything about them because they're going to watch something else. And at the end of the day, money is the thing that the showrunners are after. So that's more of a dramatic response to them. And I think that's probably what's the motivation behind said changes. Aragma has commented, um, them evil Tolkien supremacists. So yes, that's how they can label the fans. They often try and say that the fans are just supremacists. They hate anything new and diverse. But House of Dragon, I think, came out at a time where it showed the lack of depth in their arguments about the fans being racist. I'm not denying that some of the fans have been racist and that some of the comments have just been out of line, but the vast majority have had valid and solid points, and it's not nearly enough to even cause alarm from what I've seen. So I don't think that accusation can be levied against anyone in that I have seen, and I've gone on other people's videos, looked at the comments. I've spent a long time sort of searching through blogs, through reviews. Racism is not what this series is suffering from. This series is suffering from bad writing, and because it has a direct competitor coming out at the same time, it's a lot easier for people to even see the writing mistakes. Uh, because let's not lie, the vast majority of the public aren't writers. They might have a vague interest, but they're not going to look at the nitty gritties and say, well, this doesn't match with this. They'll just have a vague sense that this doesn't quite feel right. So, in order for everyone really to be kind of on the same page that there are vastly um there are vast parts of this series that don't make sense plot wise, and that's even from people who are just lay kind of watchers, then there's a real problem here. And one of the points I wanted to make, especially about the the plot, it feels as if the plot isn't really working together. And I say this because certain things happen only because they need something to happen later on and not because it makes sense within the story. So in episode 7, Galadriel and Theo are separated from everyone else, and they don't they run across a bunch of orcs. They're traveling alone together, and this doesn't really make sense because the the place that they're traveling from is not a massive town. It's not somewhere that they could easily lose everyone in their group. So the fact that they're alone together, it only happens because the writers wanted Galadriel and Theo to have a moment with each other. That was it. Not because their escape made sense. There's also a lot happening with uh, there's conflict between the stylistic elements of this series and what actually works in terms of storytelling. So this example I want to bring is when the volcano erupts. So Galadriel is standing there, not bothering to get to safety, not bothering to move. She is sort of shell shocked, and so she's just really just standing there, watching and not doing much of anything, and just staring around in horror. Which is all right. I get it. She is shell shocked. She doesn't really know what's going on. She can't believe how bad everything is gone. So I definitely don't overly criticize her response if we are just talking about the way that she's been characterized and not the way that the Galadriel we know would behave. So I don't overly criticize her response. And setting aside the fact that she probably would should be dead as a result of the blast that hit her, when Galadriel um sort of comes to after the blast has hit, she just stands there and stares around and doesn't really do much of anything again. And it's only when Theo sort of grabs her does she come to herself, and she finds a way to lead him out. Not once does she stop to help anyone else. So I understand that they were trying to show in that moment where the ashes all coming down, and everything surrounded by smoke. I understand that they were trying to show the horror of the moment. I understand that they were trying to show Galadriel's moment of recognition of what she's done. However, it doesn't work from a storytelling perspective, because no one should have been able to survive that, even with elven powers, even if she was born in Valinor under the very tree itself. No one should have been able to survive that. So it shows a conflict between the stylistic things that you're trying to do. You're trying to make this scene epic. You're trying to really dramatize her horror and her realization of how mistaken she's been about the strength of the enemy. However, it doesn't work within the confines of the story, because you've established that elves are elves can be killed. They're immortal, but they can be killed. And it takes a lot less to kill them than a volcano. It takes a stab wound to kill them. So they're not even durable in that sense. So there's a lot at conflict within the series, and I think that's a really big problem, because you begin to undermine the very foundation of your own story. So Aragna has commented, I think their writers wrote different arcs without working together, then everything was hardly glued together as best as they could. The discrepancies are too big and too many. My own worst writing is heaps better, and I'm not even a Hollywood pro script writer. Lol. Um, I don't think that in Hollywood I don't think that in Hollywood everyone who's necessarily the best writer gets the opportunity. I mean, there's nepotism, there's a lot of favoritism, and they make certain choices based on a particular message that they want to broadcast. So it's not necessarily the best writer or the most loyal to Tolkien's work that will probably get the project. Um, and I also agree with that sentiment that the writers probably didn't really work closely together. And so that's why it feels like there are so many things happening at once that aren't really tying up. For example, I don't really know if they've mastered their audience. The Harfords, whenever we interact with them, there's a really sort of merry um vibe. It feels like, yes, this could appeal to children. And then we have scenes like the cut just before we get to the Harfords of burn victims from the results of the volcano, people missing limbs, people dead, blood, gore. So we definitely have I definitely have a sense that they don't really understand what audience they're writing to. Um, I know for a fact they're not writing for the fans, because they've made so many changes and done so many things that just go against what the fans would love. And I definitely think that they were writing for a more diverse audience in terms of age and in terms of how much they love the stories. So they were writing for people who I don't think care too much about the series. Unfortunately, with that, um, if you're writing for people who don't care about the source material, you have to be captivating to these people. And the story by itself is not captivating enough, considering that your competition is House of Dragon. That's like putting it's like they've taken let's say they've taken House of Dragon would I think could be compared to Usain Bolt versus an unknown sort of runner that just came from nowhere and has just been all we've heard about them is hype, and it's been said that they've been trained by the greatest runner to ever live. But when they start running, Usain Bolt is obviously doing a lot of a better job. So I think that's what's really happened with this. They didn't anticipate their competition. They thought that the name of Tolkien alone would be enough. And I think that they've tried to write a story that they believe will resonate with people now without realizing that the people who really hold this fandom together are people who are familiar with the Peter Jackson movies and people who are familiar with the books. So the money is going to come from that demographic. It's not going to come from people who are uninterested because the story in of itself is not enough to hold them, especially the story that they're telling. Um, I liked the introduction of Celeborn. The reason why I liked this is because I it gave me some hope for a change in Galadriel. And I think that if Celeborn comes back and is able to really get through to Galadriel, then we will see a drastic change. So Aragva says, you are correct that they are not writing for the fans, though if I did what they've done, I'd be homeless. I respect my readers. It's true. I think it's easy to just disregard the fans when you have a company like Amazon backing you, and you can just easily disregard what the audience actually wants because you're never going to be in a position where you run out of money with $1 billion on a project. You're not running out of money. Um, some aspects of this series have been great. I won't deny that it's been a very pretty series visually, but some shots look off. They don't look great. They don't look like money has been spent on them. And I think that's a real problem when you give a project of this size to people who aren't experienced. And I I think that they're seeing this now, which might be the reason why they're having all these reshoots for season two. Because I'm not going to lie, season one hasn't been great. It's introduced us to one character that we can kind of root for, which is Ada, which is terrible because he's the villain. Sure, he's a victim because he is an elf that was seized by Morgoth and corrupted. And that we can see how much his corruption has damaged him. But I don't think that we should still be rooting for him. However, there's really no one else to root for except maybe Elrond, but he doesn't seem to be part of this massive war except in a very small way with the Mithril thing. So Aragma said, if Celeborn is a good masculine character and not demeaned, that could save their show. I have my doubts though. I agree with you because Galadriel's description of Celeborn worried me. Where she described him as he didn't fit his armor. I don't know if to me that signals that we're going to see a very weak male character who is just like the others. Because if we have to take Galadriel's evolution from and Theo sort of mentions this where he asks her, you dance? Because she's gone from being a rather soft by the sound of it character to being this hard masculinized character. Um at the point that we meet her. So if that is where she's evolved past the point where she was with Celeborn. So I don't it depends on how they choose to introduce Celeborn back into the story. He also has to have evolved. If not, if we're introduced to a character that has not really evolved from the way that Galadriel described him as being too scrawny for his armor, or being a silver clam, as the description she chose to use, then his presence will do nothing because she would have evolved past him. And all we're going to get is this sad reminiscence of a relationship that was cut short by a war, which will do nothing. And she will continue to be this despicable character. However, I think in order for them to really drive the plot forward, I think we need to see Celeborn come back as a harder character, as somebody who Galadriel can lean on, and that in the process changes her. So David Rogers, hello David, says, I have to go make a hospital visit, but I've enjoyed your analysis. Keep up the good work. Thank you so much, David. And get well soon. Aragno says, we can have warrior women, but they have to be written with respect and anchored in reality. I completely agree. I think with how hard this story is pushing realism with the level of blood and injuries that we've seen, I believe that they do have to anchor themselves a little bit more in reality. In the Lord of the Rings, we didn't really ever see injuries. We saw people get injured, we saw people get stabbed, but we didn't really see blood and real gore. I think it's Frodo's finger getting chopped off. We see the toll that the ring is taking on him with the fact that he's becoming more decrepit. Um, but we don't really see the level of damage that we witness in the Rings of Power. If you're going to go towards realism, which is what this show is doing in order to be able to support its changes, then you're going to also have to ground your characters in realism. Your female character can't just stand in the middle of an ash cloud and come away unharmed just with a scruffy face. That isn't going to happen. So I definitely believe that they have to change some things about the series. And if they can drastically get better moving forward, then perhaps eventually season one will be forgiven and we can look past it and say, well, it was a terrible start, but they got better and it had a strong finish. So Arachne says, read this is a chapter from my intro book. If you have some spare time, I'm just a humble indie author, but my readers say I did something right. So I definitely will. The intro book, I think I have read that, your first book, Aragma, and I might do a review of the book I read on the channel if that's all right with you. But going back to the Rings of Power, one of the other points I wanted to make um, was about some of the male characters. So Elendil is still one of my favorite characters from the series. I think he is a strong character. I think that I don't think they're utilizing him as much as they could be. However, I'm okay with what I've seen from him so far, so I'm not going to complain too much. I would like him to take a more proactive role. I would like to see him in a more leadership role, not just hear that he's a captain and see people just say things to him and just call his rank captain. I want to see him take charge. And that's what I mean by the show not do doing things and not actually earning the payoff. You can't just tell me that this character is superior. I have to see it. So I have to see him take charge. I have to see him do things that make me understand why he has the respect. So in the battle scene, what I see of Elendil is that he's pulled off his horse almost as soon as he enters the battle. That's not letting me see him as a commanding figure. I believe, and we see and Isildur rushes to save his father, but we see Halbrand spear the enemy before that can happen. I don't think that should have happened. I think we can show that Halbrand is a heroic figure by having him save someone else, but don't compromise your other main characters to make a point. You have an abundance of side characters that you could have still illustrated this point with. We don't need to see Halbrand save a major character. We've already kind of gotten to know Halbrand a bit, and we've kind of gotten to know that even he's on the right side more or less. We don't need to see him save Elendil for us to continue to trust him. I think for the most part he has our trust, even though we're still skeptical about him because we don't know why he ran, we don't know why he thinks that Ada should know him, but for the time being he's a trustworthy character. Let your other male characters shine. um I don't think that Galadriel overshadows some of the other male characters in a moralistic sense, but in terms of action, she definitely does. I think that Galadriel does too much in terms of action. She throws herself stupidly into danger. For example, the scene where she sort of is halfway off her horse or sort of bent upside down on her horse in order to take on some orcs doesn't work because any orc that sent a spear her way or even so much as grazed her horse, Galadriel would have snapped her spine and her neck clean in half. It's a stupid decision to make. But that's the Galadriel we're being introduced to. The brash doesn't think, makes really silly decisions, is routinely rescued by plot armor. So I think that um the writing as a whole just needs to get better. I don't think they understand half of the characters that they have, even the characters that they've created that are decent or even good, they don't utilize them. So yeah, they need to get better at that. So Arachna says, I'd love to hear back from you. I hope you liked at least one of the characters from the intro book. Many readers of mine are your subscribers, so they'd watch the video review. Thank you. And hello, Neutron Boar. Welcome to the live stream. Um, so basically, we're talking about the rings of power, and I've made a few points. I'm probably just going to run through them again. My first point really was just that there were some good things about this series. There are some highlights, mainly the character of Ada. Um, and there are many downsides. There were some surprising elements. The camera shot of the volcano erupting and the ash flooding in was brilliant. However, it also created some problems of its own, which is what this show tends to do a lot, where it does something kind of great and then just completely compromises it because the thing that they've just done they haven't earned, and or it creates some kind of a problem which they don't bother to deal with. For example, if you have a volcano erupting and that sheer amount of volcanic ash rushing into the plane, some characters are going to die. If you have your main characters standing head on with that volcanic ash, I expect that character to be dead or severely injured to the point where they're decommissioned from whatever they're going to do. I expected Galadriel to be incapacitated. I didn't expect her to be able to do anything else, much less ride with Halbrand to go and meet the High King. Either she's dead or unable to move or in a coma. Which is a problem that I had with the series, is that it tries to ground itself in realism so that it can give us a diverse cast, and so that it can give us some of the gore that we experience, but it doesn't bother to actually properly integrate this realism into its plot. So things happen for no reason other than the fact that the plot needs it to happen. We have Galadriel, who has elf hearing, being completely unaware of where the other Numenorians are, and being completely unaware of her surrounding and everything else, and being separated from the group with nobody other than Theo, making no attempt to rescue anyone else. But that only happens because the writers wanted Galadriel and Theo to have this heart to heart on the journey and to see the orcs, so that once again Galadriel is the only one who knows about the coming danger. So the plot continuously puts her in this point where she's needed, even though she's obnoxious. And I think that's the only way they can think of how to keep her around. So Arachna says, Ada was an interesting choice and they could have done more with his character. Yes, but with the way that the plot developed, I don't think they could have done anything more with his character within the plot that they have created. So a lot of the changes that I recommend or that I talk about are not for them to change the plot, but to do things within the plot they have already created. Because if we were asking them to change the plot, we'd ask them to change everything, and we wouldn't have anything to talk about because we'd just say scrap it all and start again. So when I'm talking about other Arda's characterization and his interaction with Galadriel. It's with the understanding that Galadriel is being perceived in the way that she's been written in the show, and not as the Galadriel that we're familiar with from the books. So Arda's back and forth with Galadriel in his interrogation really brings out um, just how far in the darkness that Galadriel is, and it reinforces the fact that she's not a likable character, and reinforces the fact that she is slipping and that she's morally grey. So I think that if we can separate our view of Galadriel as the character that we know from the books, and this Galadriel, then it's a lot easier to see what they're doing with her. They're not trying to make Galadriel a likable character. They are deliberately making her detestable. And this is evident in the fact that every single character is more or less calling her out on the fact that she's horrible and they don't like her. Even we can say that Galadriel's the reason that Numenor came to Middle Earth, but that move would never have been made if Halbrand wasn't on board, because the Queen herself doesn't like Galadriel. You can see that from their interaction. Yeah, they have that whole woman thing of save your pity for the enemy's elf, and they have this alliance, but it's not pleasant. They're not friends. And this is because Galadriel publicly insulted the queen in front of her court. So Galadriel doesn't have friends. She doesn't have people who approve of her decisions. Her own best friend within the context of this plot, Elrond, was willing to follow his king and send her away, because even though they're best friends, she's done too much. She's doing too much. And so I think that the writers are deliberately making her this way. And they are aware that they're making her detestable. So Neutron Ball says, I can't type today. It's okay. I can't speak today either. Galadriel is tiresome to watch. I definitely agree with that, but I think, like I was saying, I think that's a deliberate choice by the writers, because I believe, and there is evidence to support this belief, that they are preparing her for a drastic character arc. Maybe not in this season at all, or maybe halfway through season 2, because with the pacing of the show, we might be waiting for a whole season 3 before we see Galadriel change at all. Arachne says, a love scene between Galadriel and Halbrand. I don't know if I think that Galadriel and Halbrand will end up together. Um, or have any sort of romance. I think the two of them are bonding as comrades, and because there's no tension between the two of them. They share things as soldiers. They're trying to make Galadriel kind of toughen, and yes, she cares in some way about Halbrand, but it's really just because he's part of her cause. She doesn't care about him as a human being. Don't mistake Galadriel smiling at him a few times for Galadriel changing or having a romantic interest in him. Look at the way Galadriel acts towards towards the human race that she encounters. Look at the way that she manipulates him in Numenor in order to get what she wants. She has no regard for this guy other than what she needs him to be. So one scene between them sitting down together and sort of going, we'll fight together, it's because he's doing what she wants him to do. He's playing a role that she wants him to play. And that's why this sort of comrade relationship is coming out. It's not coming out because they like each other. Halbrand hasn't forgotten the way that she acted towards him in Numenor. And there's reason to believe that Halbrand isn't stupid. He has his own motives, and the fact that he's even given in so easily to being the king of the Southlands is a little bit suspicious, considering how much he wanted to stay in Numenor. This is a character who is capable of extreme violence, as we saw in his fight with the Numenorians. This is a character who's capable of lying. We saw him give a whole dramatic scene where he convinces everyone to go to be jolly and everything so he could steal one of their crests. This is a character that's shady. He's not clean cut. He's not even bootleg Aragorn, because there's none of the upright morality that Aragorn had in Halbrand. this is not a character that we can completely trust. For now, we know that he's fighting on the right side, which is why I stand by what I said about Halbrand saving Elendil. I don't think we needed that to happen. But I don't think that this is a character who is comfortable playing by other people's rules. He's going to play along so long as it suits him. And just like he did in the marketplace, where he sort of sweetened everybody up and bought everyone drinks, it was so he could steal the crest. So from what the writers have shown us, even though they're not great writers, so if this goes out of the window and they completely forget all the characterization that they've done, I wouldn't be surprised. But let's just say that they know what they're doing in this regard. I don't think they're setting up a love story between Galadriel and Halbrand just because the two of them are manipulative. The two of them are willing to use people. They know how to win people around. They know what to do in order to get what they want. And I don't think both of them want the same thing. They're just playing along with each other because at the moment they seem to be going towards the same goal. Halbrand saying that I won't allow these people to suffer and neither will you sounds great. But I'm not so willing to discard everything he's said and done before to believe one sentence he said in the last episode. So let's see. Arachne says maybe they're going for a love triangle sort of drama between Galadriel, Halbrand, and Celeborn. I think that would just be pointless. I don't understand the. I don't see the appeal of doing something like that. I think there'll probably be tension because I don't believe that Halbrand's intentions are exactly what he's presenting them to be. I think that he's going to further manipulate Galadriel. And I'm not saying that manipulate Galadriel like she's some saint. I'm saying that they're both equally as manipulative as each other, and they're both trying to use each other for the time being. Because remember, Galadriel was the person who started this manipulation first. We also know from the raft scene that Halbrand is willing to use and dump his comrades as it sees him fit. He is self-preservation above everything else and he has shown no remorse for that action. I do not believe he's changed in the matter of days. So, or even if it's a week, I doubt he's changed that much. So, I don't think they're going to set up a romance. I think that potentially they may try and frame it as maybe Halbrand might use a romance in order to try and further manipulate Galadriel. I don't think it's actually going to be a real thing. I think they're going to continue using this comrade relationship. If they do make it a romance, it won't ever be a true one. It will, at most, and this is me saying if they do go for that option, it will be at most a manipulative chess game between the three of them if they ever do something like this. So let's see. Arachne says Halbrand is not Sauron. I don't think he's Sauron either, because Sauron is a Maya. Sauron is incredibly powerful, but Sauron is incredibly prideful at the same time. So it's own. Remember, Sauron is only sort of docile, if I can say that, when he's taken in by Numenor. And even then, he makes his form beautiful. It wouldn't make sense for Sauron to take the form of an average man and not in some way try and beautify himself, because that's the whole point of the second age. The whole point of the end of the second age is that Sauron loses his ability to appear attractive, and he loses his ability to use subtle forms of manipulation. Now he just has to use open warfare because he doesn't have an ability to seduce people anymore. He's lost that ability to seduce people. So the second age is really when he's using the most of his seductive power, because then he's come out after the first stage, he's come out of the shadow of Morgoth and he's now sort of his own master. So he's using those subtle bits of manipulation. Remember, they've been weakened after the War of Wrath. So he's not going to use open forms of of violence, and the second age is where he's using these subtle forms. It's in the third age that we see Sauron really using open forms of violence and using hordes of armies and things like that. So there's a difference in tone and shift, and I don't think Halbrand is it. If they've made him that, it doesn't make sense in the slightest. Would it be a complete shock with how this series has been? But I don't think even they would make that kind of mistake. So Neutron Ball says, makes sense. I find her too linear and predictable. If she's supposed to be obnoxious, then all good, but a little more flavor is needed, I think. I also believe so too, and I think they do try to do that. They try and give Galadriel these profound things to say. They're not profound, they're lazily written, and they don't really make much sense when you go past the surface. They try and have her interact with characters like Theo or Bronwyn and give her sort of a sympathetic or softer look, um, in order for us to say that, oh no, she's not completely bad, but it's not done enough, and she's already been presented to us as such a obnoxious and horrible character that when she shows her good side, it's like we see what the writers are trying to do, but we don't really feel it. And so I think we're going to need more time with this character, and we're going to need a flashback. Give Galadriel a flashback, because so far we've seen nothing. It's one thing for her to say these throwaway lines about pride, which is completely hypocritical, but we need to see Galadriel as she was before. We can't go off this hearsay. We need to see it. And that's what I say about the series. They do a lot of things, but they haven't worked for them. They want us to see Galadriel as this multifaceted character who's been tortured, and but we don't see it. You can't just tell us and we believe it. We have to see the character as she was before. We have to see flashbacks. We have to see scenes where she's contemplating on things and contemplating her own morality. We never see that. We just see her staring into the distance and we're supposed to assume her thoughts. We can't do that. So Aragna says, Nishambor, they could have made a proper warrior princess if they really did their homework. Tolkien's Galadriel is probably one of the most powerful sorceresses in Middle Earth. I agree with that because I think that Tolkien wrote Galadriel extremely well, and the way that they've deviated from her is a real tragedy. However, I think that translating that to screen in the way that they would have Galadriel at the forefront, having somebody with magic constantly be at the forefront, I don't think would have worked with what they wanted to do. They wanted action scenes. They wanted scenes that were very high, intense scenes. And Tolkien had a very particular system of magic. Tolkien's system of magic was not Harry Potter's system of magic. There are no blinding lights shooting from the sky or shooting from the edge of a wand. There's no earthquakes happening because you shot a spell at the base of it, at the base of a mountain. It's not flashy. And what they wanted for this series was flashy. They wanted the sword fight and they wanted Galadriel to be a recognizable character that brings the fans and the non-fans all together. But they had to drastically change her character in order for her to be a forefront character and still have this sword fight without completely disrupting the systems of magic that make up Tolkien. If not, it turns into Harry Potter, an ancient Harry Potter fanfic, basically. So Gina asks, if you had to write Galadriel's character, how would you have done it? I wouldn't have changed her, period, from what was written in the books. I don't think they had to reinvent Galadriel's character. You could have kept her the way that she was. However, if I had to rephrase the question perhaps and say how would I fix this Galadriel that we have been presented with, and I'm going to sort of limit myself here because I'm going to work with what they've given us and perhaps see how I can tweak things, still going in line with the showrunner's vision, but tweak things in order to make her more palatable to everyone. So let's say we begin with as they began with Galadriel in her youth. I would have taken away that scene where she beats up somebody because that's just stupid. She beats up another child in the opening scene of episode 1. That wouldn't make sense because Galadriel is a princess. She is the granddaughter of Finwë, High King Finwë of the Noldor, an entire massive tribe of the elves. She is the granddaughter of the High King. So there is no way Galadriel would have ever been in a position to get bullied by some random kids. It just wouldn't have happened. So that scene doesn't make sense. And the thing is, it contradicts her introduction to Numenor when she goes up to the Numenorians in the courtroom and she says she's of the Golden House of Finarfin. Well, if you're of the Golden House of Finarfin, then why were you getting bullied by a bunch of random kids in Valinor of all places? So I would first of all change that beginning scene and give Galadriel a softer beginning. Really show us her innocence. Let's start with a Galadriel that we can root for. Let's spend some time in Valinor with a Galadriel that's likable, so that when we're introduced to Gailadriel, as everyone's coining it, it's a lot more palatable. We're not so quick to say, "Oh, I hate her," because we've spent some time with a Galadriel that we like. Now, the mystery created between these two images is how does she get from here to here? As we get go through the story with Gailadriel and see her erratic decisions and see her bad attitude, interject some flashbacks in between these scenes and show us the transformation. Show us not just like graze over it. Show us in detail, or not all the details. Don't make a whole film out of it, but show us in enough detail how these relationships that she had with her brother and her husband were broken up by war. Link us emotionally to the character by letting us into her past visually. Don't just have her talk about it with some 14-year-old under a tree. Let us see it. And that's how I would rewrite this Galadriel. If I had to choose, I wouldn't need to because I would have just stuck with Tolkien's Galadriel. But if we're going with the showrunner's Galadriel, these are how they could have made her more palatable and more acceptable to the fans. And also link us with the character that you expect to be the vehicle for how your viewers are going to go through this series rather than pitting us against her. We don't need to ally ourselves with the villain. That's a sign you're doing something wrong. So, kind of moving on from that question and summarizing all my thoughts, because for the first live stream, I had, I think, 5 episodes at that point to sort of get through. But the last 2 episodes, I'm going to try and make a positive sort of finish for them. I think the introduction of Celeborn, even though we don't see him and there's no flashback to show us what he looks like, but the mentioning of Celeborn was a good thing because if we follow the line of thinking that the showrunners have for the character of Galadriel, his introduction will potentially give us a Galadriel that's more palatable. So that's an encouraging thing that the show has introduced. I think in terms of camera work, the show has gotten better. There are less scenes in which the show randomly focuses on things that have no significance. So that's a good thing and an improvement. But on the downside, there are still a lot of writing issues. And I think this is because there's so many things that were introduced in the first few episodes that it's really difficult to round them all up or make them make sense. The pacing of the show has been off. It's taken so long to build interest, and we've had to detach ourselves from the source material in order to actually even enjoy some of the aspects of the series. So I believe that if they can tidy up the writing, hire people who know how to write dialogue, stop trying to give us profound sentences that don't make sense, then the show will get better. Another thing that I would recommend, stick to the mode of language, stick to one mode of language. We can't have you using thou in one sentence and okay and all right in another sentence. What period are you writing in? Are we in a Middle Ages esque period or are we in the 2000s? You have to actually um, know what period you're writing in. Stop giving us profound sentences like um, do not despise the work of the humble, and then you have characters saying, yeah, okay, I if that's okay with you. The tone is completely off. Do not despise hu- uh, like humble beginnings, or do not despise the work of the humble, for it's the proud that bring down kingdoms. Okay, fair enough. Is that if that is the style of language that we're going for, then let's keep that up. But if we're saying, okay, how was your day, in another in another sentence, you throw the reader off and it doesn't make sense. There's no continuity. And I think that if we can if we can kind of get small things like that right within the next couple of episodes, or however many episodes they have left, these small improvements will improve the show. It won't fix everything because again there are big structural issues, but it will improve it somewhat. It will give us some sense of world building, because things like that, how the characters speak, that's a world building issue. Again, they were lazy with the whole diversity thing because we have no idea um what a typical Southlander is supposed to look like, because apparently you can have black, Asian, white Southlanders, and you'd ask yourself, okay, how do all these ethnic groups end up in one particular small rural area of Middle Earth? No explanation for that. They're not a major trading point. It's not Lake Town. So there's not a major trading point. It's a rural area in the middle of Middle Earth, near a forest, mind you. So it's not even an area where we would say, okay, this place had loads of traffic and traders came from all corners of Middle Earth. It doesn't make sense. Numenor, it, I understand why there's a little bit more racial diversity in Numenor. That I can forgive. But it seems like the showrunners just wanted to tick boxes and they didn't care how they did that. In comparison, House of Dragon or Game of Thrones, we were able to see the world building even in the races of the characters. People from places like Dawn, which is more in the south and has more sunshine and beaches, they have a Mediterranean um, outlook. They have more tan skin. People across the Red Sea or the Narrow Sea have darker skinned, you have more Arabs and Africans, and it enriches the whole place. And then people from the north, where it's cold and dark all the time, pale. We don't see black people there unless they're coming for a specific errand. And that makes sense. And I don't think anyone can say that that Game of Thrones wasn't diverse. There was an abundance of ethnically diverse characters and actors, but it was done properly. It wasn't done lazily in the same way that it's being done in Lord of the Rings. Not Lord of the Rings, sorry, the Rings of Power. But yeah, that's sort of my review of the series so far and of the episodes that we have had access to. I hope that we will see improvements. Um, I'm a little bit hopeful just because I think I get an idea of where they're going with this. And if they can change the writers drastically, then things will improve. If they carry on and do not listen to the apathetic fans, then I don't see this project going well, because I don't, like I mentioned earlier, I don't see the showrunners listening to negative reviews. I think they've created an environment where negative reviews don't matter to them. But if the people who aren't watching the show, the people who are have lukewarm reviews of the show, the people who don't care are not watching, people who are tuning in to House of Dragon, their competition regularly, those are the sort of reactions that are actually going to provoke changes rather than negative reviews or slamming it, because their whole marketing campaign was, we're throwing diversity out there, and if you don't like it, you're racist. That was the marketing for Rings of Power. So they've already prepared themselves for negative reviews. But what they haven't prepared for is people just saying, I don't care, it's not interesting, I'm not watching it. So going back to the chat, Aragna says, Gina Fotso, are you asking Malika or me? I don't think I'm worthy to try and rewrite what Tolkien did. Gina replies, lol, never underestimate yourself. I was asking Malika though. It would be interesting to hear your thoughts too. To which Aragma replies, I feel like I'm just reading a book now. To which Aragma replies, at Gina Fotso, Xena the Warrior Princess has already been pulled off, and quite successfully, if I might say so myself. To which Gina replies, maybe Xena is the inspiration for Galadriel. um and yes, I agree with Aragma when he says Xena was a lovable character. I watched Xena the Warrior Princess growing up. Um, I watched all the episodes for all the seasons. Now that I think about it, wow, where did I get the time to do that? But yeah, um, I watched it and I loved it. I loved Gabrielle. I loved her character arc within Xena the Warrior Princess, and how she grew from this sort of skillless female character to having an abundance of skill, and she still kept her softness about her. She softened Xena. She made Xena want to be a better person morally. Of course, it was fantastical. Xena flipping through the air, throwing a disc everywhere, and doing things that we know wasn't possible. But also remember that Lucy Lawless is a tall and broad-shouldered woman, so she looked the part. She looked like she was physically strong. If you look at Lucy Lawless standing next to most of the male characters, she's either almost their height or the same height. So everything was made to make us believe that Lucy Lawless was this muscular, powerful woman. She wasn't a skinny, small, petite actress in the way that Miss Clark, who plays Galadriel in The Rings of Power, is. So there was a visual support to go with what the character that she was trying to play. She came across as tough. She had a slightly masculine look to her as well, because she was tall, muscular, and she has quite a square jaw. She was pretty, so there was definitely the feminine element to her, and there were episodes where we see the more feminine side of Xena, especially when she had a child, or we see her with her various love interests. So I think Xena is a very good example of what they could have done with Galadriel in this series. I don't think any change to Galadriel from the books would have sat well with fans. But if they had made the Galadriel in Rings of Power more likable, it definitely could have helped. And so, with that, I'm probably going to close this live stream. Thank you so much for watching, guys. I hope that the series gets better. I hope that you guys tune in next time. I will definitely be talking about this. I'm also going to talk about the House of Dragon, but I want to watch a few episodes before I do that, so that I have a lot to talk about. And I'm trying to set up my software to be able to watch to do a watch party of the Lord of the Rings Peter Jackson trilogy. So look out for that. When I get someone more tech savvy than I to help me set that up. So look out for that. Thank you so much, everyone, for your contributions. I hope you have a lovely evening or day, depending on what time zone you're in. So this has been the Malika Writes channel. Thank you so much for watching.